The first time Cassian Varese looked afraid, the courtroom was so quiet that even the rain against the stained glass windows sounded intrusive. Men who had seen him order executions without lifting his voice had sworn that fear did not live anywhere inside him. Fear belonged to lesser men, men with empty pockets and shallow graves waiting for them. Cassian belonged to marble foyers, blood oath handshakes, and the sort of silence that made other people confess before he even spoke. But on the day the state put him on trial for murder, there was one woman sitting in the witness box with her hands folded in her lap, and the entire fate of a feared empire seemed to rest inside the small white space between her lips. If Aurelia Belante had told the truth, he would have walked out free. If she had spoken the words only she could speak, the case against him would have broken like ice under a boot. Instead, she lifted her chin, met his eyes, and said nothing that could save him. In that moment, the room changed shape around him. The prosecutors kept talking. The judge leaned forward, pens scratched over paper. Somewhere in the back, a reporter coughed into his fist. But Cassian only saw her. He saw the woman he had married beneath a cathedral ceiling lit by 100 burning candles. He saw the woman whose pulse he had once felt tremble beneath his mouth in the dark. He saw the woman who had learned the geography of his scars with her fingertips and had sworn, in the most private corner of his life, that she would never lie to him when it mattered. Yet there she was, dressed in midnight blue, her face pale and heartbreakingly composed, letting his enemies build a cage around him brick by brick, while she sat inside the only doorway out. The verdict had not come yet, but he knew then that whatever happened next would haunt him longer than a prison sentence ever could. Aurelia did not look cruel. That was what made it worse. Cruelty would have been easier to understand. Hatred would have given him something clean to hold on to. But there was no triumph in her eyes, no revenge, no cold satisfaction. There was only grief so dense it made her look as if she were already mourning him. And that grief followed him all the way to the moment the jury found him guilty. It followed him when the judge pronounced 15 years, with parole possible after 3. It followed him when federal officers closed around him, an iron clamped over his wrists, and it followed him when he turned one last time toward the gallery and found that she was no longer there. She had not stayed to watch him taken away. She had vanished before the sentence finished echoing, leaving behind only a silence so complete that he would spend 3 years inside concrete and steel trying to figure out whether it had been born of betrayal, terror, or some deeper wound he had been too proud to see. Before the trial, before the indictment, before his name was dragged through headlines and spoken in the same breath as the dead judge he had been accused of killing, Cassian and Aurelia had been the kind of story people whispered about in expensive restaurants and dim back rooms. Not because it was romantic at first. At first it was anything but. Aurelia Belante had been the daughter of Vittorio Belante, a silk-suited gambler with a smile too weak for the debts he made. Her mother had died young. Her father loved cards, horses, and women who laughed too hard at his lies. What he did not love enough were consequences. By the time Aurelia was 24, the Belante family home had been mortgaged 3 times. The art on the walls was mostly fake, and the men coming to collect what Vittorio owed had stopped knocking politely. The city knew Cassian Varese as the man who inherited a bruised criminal dynasty and turned it into something terrifyingly efficient before his 30th birthday. Where Vittorio was soft and slippery, Cassian was made of angles and restraint. People feared him because he did not waste motion. He never needed to. The arrangement that bound Aurelia to him was born the way so many things in that world were born, over whiskey, debt ledgers, and the threat of violence concealed beneath civilized language. Vittorio Bellante owed the Veresi family money he could not repay. He also owed information to a rival crew, which was worse. Cassian could have ruined him in a week. Instead, he offered a settlement that felt less like mercy than strategy. He would absorb Bellante's shipping assets, erase the debt, spare Vittorio's life, and place Bellante operations under Veresi protection. In return, Aurelia would become his wife. People called it a merger. Aurelia called it a sentence. She had spent her life in rooms where men gambled with things that belonged to women, but she had never imagined the final coin on the table would be her own future. She said no once, twice, 3 times. Her father cried. Her younger brother, Tomas, begged her to run. But there are moments when running only gets everyone you love buried faster, and Aurelia had already learned what fear smelled like when it stood on a doorstep in polished shoes. The first night she met Cassian alone, she expected monstrosity. She expected a man who enjoyed power too much, who would mistake her silence for obedience and her survival for consent. Instead, she found him standing by a long window in the Veresi townhouse, one hand tucked into his coat pocket, city light cutting silver across the hard lines of his face. He was not handsome in the soft way magazines preferred. He was arresting, severe, the kind of man who looked carved rather than born. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and maddeningly calm. He told her he would not pretend the marriage was anything but an arrangement. He told her he had no interest in humiliating her, touching her without permission, or forcing affection from someone who had every right to despise him. He told her her father's choices created the situation, not her own. Then, with the kind of precision that made every word feel chosen, he said, "I am not asking you to love me, Aurelia. I am asking you to understand that once you take my name, no one touches what is mine." It should have sounded possessive. Somehow, it sounded like protection. That difference was the first crack in the story she had built about him. The second came at the wedding itself. The cathedral was lit like judgment. Candles trembled beneath the frescoed ceiling, while half the city's most dangerous men stood in suits dark enough to pass for mourning clothes. Aurelia wore ivory satin that felt too heavy on her shoulders. Cassian wore black. They looked less like bride and groom than 2 aristocratic ghosts being sealed into a pact older than either of them. Yet when she nearly stumbled on the altar steps because her hands were numb and her heartbeat was too loud, the Cassian's hand steadied her, firm and warm at her waist, his grip brief enough not to embarrass her. During the vows, his gaze never wandered. During the reception, when one of Vittorio's drunken associates made a joke about how much a Bellante daughter must cost by the hour, Cassian shattered the man's nose with one brutal strike and had him dragged out before the blood stopped running. He did not apologize to the room. He simply turned to Aurelia, offered her a clean napkin for the flecks of red that had touched her glove, and asked her if she wanted to go home. Home, at first, was another hard word to believe in. The Cassian estate on the north edge of the city looked like old money dipped in shadow. Black wrought iron, stone lions on the steps, polished floors that reflected chandeliers like frozen fire. Cassian's mother, Isolde Veresi, received Aurelia with cool elegance and the unmistakable disappointment of a woman who had wanted a more politically useful daughter-in-law. His uncle Octavian smiled too often to be trusted. His grandmother Sabina watched Aurelia with unsettling intelligence, as if measuring not whether she belonged there, but whether she would survive it. The staff moved around Cassian like he was gravity. Men came and went at strange hours. Whispered names drifted under closed doors. There were always flowers in Aurelia's room, always clean sheets, always a car ready if she wished to leave for the gallery district or the conservatory. Yet she moved through that mansion like a prisoner in silk, braced for the inevitable moment the civility would break and the truth of their marriage would reveal itself in uglier colors. But Cassian remained a contradiction she could not solve. He was merciless in business, yes. She overheard enough to know the rumors undersold him. A crew that skimmed from his books disappeared. A nightclub owner who switched loyalty twice in one season ended up bankrupt and exiled. Men feared his restraint more than another Don's temper because restraint meant calculation, and calculation meant consequences measured to hurt the longest. Yet with Aurelia, he remained almost infuriatingly careful. He did not demand she share his bed. He did not ask where she went in the afternoons or whose paintings she preferred. When he noticed she stopped eating whenever Vittorio came to the estate smelling of liquor and apologies, he barred her father from entry unless invited by her personally. When Thomas was beaten behind a card room for refusing to carry messages, Cassian found the men responsible and returned Thomas home without a broken bone on him. And when Aurelia thanked him, expecting him to turn that gratitude into leverage, he only said, "You do not owe me for decency." Men like him were not supposed to understand decency at all. That was the problem. The more she saw, the more dangerous it became to feel anything. It did not happen all at once. No single night transformed duty into longing. It was slower than that, more treacherous. It lived in small things, in the way he listened when she spoke about art restoration as if the work mattered, in the way he remembered that she hated white roses because they smelled like funeral parlors and replaced them with gardenias, in the rare moments when exhaustion loosened the mask on his face and she glimpsed a lonely architecture underneath it. Cassian had been raised in a house where affection was rationed and weakness punished. His father had taught him that love made men sloppy. His mother had taught him that tenderness in public invited knives. By the time he inherited the Veresi organization, he wore self-control like armor so old it had fused with bone. Aurelia saw that. She also saw what it cost him. On winter evenings, when the city lights blurred behind sleet and the house quieted, he sometimes came to the library where she read and stood by the fire without speaking, as if her presence alone lowered something jagged inside him. She began to leave the lamp on for him. He began to stay longer. The first time they touched like husband and wife, it was not after a grand confession, but after a storm. The power had gone out over part of the estate. Lightning kept flashing beyond the terrace doors. Aurelia, who had never admitted to anyone that thunder still unsettled her from childhood nights waiting for her father to come home alive, stood on the balcony trying to look braver than she felt. Cassian found her there, coatless, rain-scented, his shirt collar open from a meeting that had clearly gone badly. He asked if she was cold. She said no, and the lie must have shown because one corner of his mouth tilted in the ghost of a smile. When thunder cracked so close the glass rattled, she flinched. He moved then, not fast enough to startle her, just close enough that his body shielded the wind. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said, and for reasons she never fully understood, that simple sentence undid her more than any seduction could have. She looked up, saw something raw and unsheltered in his eyes, and kissed him first. The rest of it was slow, reverent, almost shockingly gentle. Afterward, with the storm rolling away from the city, he pressed his forehead to hers and murmured, "If the day comes when the world turns on me, don't lie to me, Aurelia. I can survive almost anything but that." She promised him she never would. For a while, it seemed possible that their impossible marriage might become something no one had intended, but both of them had begun to need. They dined alone when the family was away and argued about books and politics and whether redemption was real. He took her driving at midnight along the river because she had once mentioned missing the feeling of speed without purpose. She restored a cracked oil portrait in the Veresi chapel, and he stood beside her while she worked, asking surprisingly patient questions about pigment and varnish, as if he wanted to understand how damaged things could be made beautiful again. In public, they were formidable together, the feared Don and the elegant wife, who made men lower their eyes without raising her voice. In private, the walls between them softened. Cassian learned that Aurelia laughed hardest when she was truly exhausted. Aurelia learned that Cassian slept only 4 hours a night and read poetry he pretended to dislike. By spring, the arranged marriage had become the one place in either of their lives where strategy kept failing and something honest kept taking its place. That was when the danger sharpened. Power changes shape when men try to clean it up. Cassian had inherited rackets dirtier than he wanted. The city's old machinery of vice had long since spread into trafficking routes, synthetic narcotics, and government favors bought with girls and children and men who never got named in newspapers. He despised that side of the business for reasons he rarely spoke about. Maybe because his younger sister died years earlier after being used as leverage in a war between crews. Maybe because certain lines, once crossed, leave a smell on the soul that no amount of money can cover. Whatever the reason, he began to cut away the empire's ugliest limbs and push for racy money into shipping, construction, and imported luxury goods. It made him enemies among rivals. Worse, it made him enemies inside his own house. Dorian Sarno, his consigliere, had the polished patience of a man who knew exactly how trustworthy he looked. He had served Cassian's father, then Cassian, and everyone called him loyal because no one ever caught him being anything else. Aurelia never liked the way his eyes lingered half a second too long on weakness. She sensed the fracture before she understood it. Dorian smiled too readily whenever Cassian spoke of turning the docks legal. Octavian began pushing for more aggressive alliances. Strange names appeared in ledgers Thomas accidentally glimpsed while helping at the Belante warehouses. A federal judge named Harold Wren, famous for clean hands and brutal sentencing, started digging into shell companies tied to shipments moving through Verace-controlled piers. Cassian pretended not to worry Aurelia, but she could feel tension in him the way one feels humidity before a storm. He slept even less. He took more calls in the chapel, because it was the one room in the house with history thick enough to swallow sound. One evening, as Aurelia crossed the downstairs corridor, she heard his voice through the partly open study door, colder than she had ever heard him in private. "If I find out someone inside this family is still moving flesh, I won't bury them with respect." When she looked in, Dorian stood across from him, immaculate in charcoal wool, nodding with grave agreement. Only his hands gave him away. His fingers were curled too tightly behind his back. Around that time, Aurelia learned she was pregnant. The revelation arrived in the most ordinary way possible. Dizziness while restoring a canvas, a doctor summoned quietly, a pulse at her wrist, a gentle smile. She was carrying Cassian's child. For one suspended hour, the city outside seemed to disappear. She sat alone in the sunroom with her palm pressed to her still flat abdomen, trying to imagine a future she had never let herself want. A child with Cassian's eyes. A child born into danger, yes, but perhaps also into the only love either of them had ever built from ruin. She planned to tell him that night. She even wore the green dress he once said made her look like spring, finding a way through winter stone. But before evening fell, Thomas arrived at the estate bruised, breathless, and terrified. He had found shipping manifests hidden under Belante invoices. He had seen names, routes, cash transfers to a holding company linked not to Cassian, but to Dorian and a corrupt assistant district attorney named Gideon Vale. He brought one page to Aurelia because he did not know whom else to trust. That page felt like a match dropped in a dry forest. She went to Cassian immediately, but he had already left for a meeting with Judge Wren's intermediary. Dorian intercepted her in the lower hall, all concern and polished courtesy, asking whether she looked unwell. She lied. He watched her a moment too long. That night, Cassian never came home. Instead, the news broke just before dawn. Judge Harold Wren was shot in his car outside the federal building. The weapon found abandoned 2 streets away was tied to a Verace cache. Security footage placed one of Cassian's cars near the scene. An anonymous witness claimed to have seen him arguing with Wren days earlier. Federal agents swarmed the estate before breakfast. Aurelia stood on the top of the staircase in her nightclothes and watched men with rifles flood marble floors that still smelled faintly of lemon polish and coffee. Cassian did not resist arrest. He looked up at her only once as they led him out, and the force of that look nearly stopped her heart. He was not afraid then. He was furious, and beneath the fury was a certainty that chilled her. He already knew someone close had betrayed him. The evidence against him was efficient, almost elegant, too elegant. It should have reassured Aurelia that the truth would surface quickly. Instead, it terrified her more. She knew exactly where Cassian was at the hour of the murder because he had been with her in the family chapel, helping transfer old charitable deeds to shield them from a tax raid Isolde feared. The caretaker had been away. No one else knew. It was the cleanest. Cassian survived prison the way storms survive coastlines, by battering himself into something rawer and more unbreakable. The federal facility did not know what to do with a man like him. Some inmates tried to test him. A few did not try twice. Guards either despised him or respected him in the ugly, fascinated way institutions sometimes respect men they cannot fully bend. But the prison did exactly what Dorian intended in one regard. It gave Cassian time. Too much time. Time to replay the trial until Aurelia's silence became an endless corridor with no door at the end. Time to revisit every conversation, every touch, every promise, searching for the moment he had mistaken necessity for love. He told himself she had chosen herself. He told himself she had seen which way power was moving and stepped aside before it crushed her. He told himself whatever was required to live through the humiliation of still missing her. Yet some traitorous part of him refused to let the story settle, because when he pictured the witness stand, he never saw malice in her face. He saw terror. And terror meant there had been something else in the room with them that day, something invisible and lethal. He just did not know what. 3 years is enough time for empires to rot from the inside. By the time Cassian's sentence was reduced after an appeals court uncovered procedural misconduct by Gideon Vale's office, the city he returned to no longer bore the shape he had left. Octavian had served as acting head, smiling for donors and newspapers, but the streets whispered Dorian's name as the real power behind the curtains. The trafficking routes Cassian had tried to cut were flourishing again. Men who should have been dead or exiled had crept back into profitable corners. Judges attended private dinners on yachts no one photographed. Construction unions shifted loyalty. Even the Veracey house felt different when he stepped through its doors after release. Leaner than before, colder in the eyes, every movement stripped of softness. Isolde kissed his cheek with tears she rarely permitted herself. Octavian embraced him too tightly. Dorian stood slightly behind them all, immaculate and composed, saying how deeply the family had suffered in his absence. Cassian shook his hand and felt, beneath the polished welcome, the same old instinct he had ignored before the trial. If a snake learns to wear a necktie, it is still a snake. He asked for Aurelia on the first night home. The dining room went quiet. Isolde's expression hardened. Octavian said no one had heard from her since the trial. Some claimed she fled overseas with Belante cash. Others said she had taken a lover before sentencing and used the chaos to vanish. Dorian, with a flawlessly sympathetic sorrow, murmured that heartbreak drove people to ugly choices. Cassian nearly put a knife through his throat for that line alone. But Sabina, old enough not to fear anyone at the table, spoke over the silence and said only this: "Some women disappear because they are faithless. Some disappear because they are hunted. Learn the difference before you bury what remains." It was not an answer. It was enough to keep him from doing something irreversible before dawn. Later that night, in the library, Sabina handed him an envelope containing a single photograph taken from far away on a coastal street. A woman in a dark coat stood beside a little boy with a knit cap pulled over his ears. The boy had one hand wrapped around her fingers. Cassian stared so long his vision blurred. "Where?" he asked. Sabina told him the town, and nothing more. San Celeste in early spring smelled of tidewater, diesel, and damp stone. Cassian drove there alone, ignoring every warning from the men who insisted the city needed him visible. The road followed cliffs above a steel-gray sea. By the time he reached the town, rain had begun, thin and bitter. He found the address Sabina gave him, a cottage tucked behind an old music school with blue shutters and geranium boxes not yet in bloom. For several minutes he simply sat in the car with his hands fixed on the wheel, feeling something he had not allowed himself since prison, loosen and sharpen at once. Then the cottage door opened. Aurelia stepped out carrying a basket of laundry against her hip. She looked thinner, older in a way that had nothing to do with years and everything to do with endurance. Her hair was pinned carelessly. There was paint on one sleeve. She turned toward the clothesline and called over her shoulder, "Stay where I can see you, Nerio." A small boy darted into view behind her, laughing because he had ignored her instruction by half a second and believed himself very clever. Cassian forgot how to breathe. The child's eyes were his own. There are revelations that crash through a person like thunder, and then there are revelations that enter almost silently and rearrange the foundations beneath every memory. Cassian got out of the car because his body seemed to remember how, before his mind did. Aurelia looked up. The basket slipped from her arms. White sheets spilled into wet gravel. For one suspended instant, no one moved, not even the child. Then Nerio, sensing a danger he could not name, went to press himself against Aurelia's leg. Cassian crossed the small yard in 3 measured steps and stopped close enough to see her shaking. "How old?" he asked. His voice did not sound like his own. Aurelia swallowed once. 2.5. The arithmetic landed like a blade. Conceived before the trial, before the witness stand, before the silence. Cassian's jaw locked so hard it hurt. "Mine?" The question insulted both of them, but pain rarely speaks with grace. Aurelia's answer came like a wound opened cleanly. "Yes." Nerio peered up at him with solemn, storm-gray eyes that belonged unmistakably to the Veraci bloodline, and all the fury in Cassian's body collided with something softer and far more dangerous. He did not touch the child. He could not trust his hands. He looked instead at Aurelia, at the woman he had loved, hated, mourned, and now found standing in sea wind with his son hidden behind her skirts. "You let me rot in prison," he said, so quietly that the quiet itself became a threat. "You let me believe you chose to destroy me, and all that time—" He glanced at Nerio and cut himself off. Aurelia's face went paper white. "I never chose to destroy you." "Then why?" The word came harder now. "Why the trial? Why the silence? Why this?" Her gaze flicked toward the road, toward neighboring windows, toward every place fear learns to live after years of being fed. "Not here. No, here, now. I buried 3 years under that question." She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her hands tightened around Nerio's shoulders with almost painful protectiveness. In her eyes she saw terror again, the same terror from the witness stand, and that should have changed everything. Instead, it inflamed him, because if she still feared something after all this time, why did she not come to him? Why did she decide alone what he could survive and what he could not? "You don't get more silence, not from me." Whatever argument might have followed died under the crack of gunfire. The first shot shattered a ceramic pot by the music school steps. Aurelia shoved Nerio down so fast the boy barely had time to cry out. Cassian moved on instinct, dragging them all behind the low stone wall bordering the yard, as 2 more shots bit into wood and mortar. A dark sedan accelerated away at the end of the lane before he could return fire. The attack lasted seconds. Its message lasted longer. Aurelia was breathing too fast. Nerio had started crying into her coat. Cassian looked over the wall at the chipped stone, the angle of the shots, the road clear enough for a clean escape, professional enough to frighten, not necessarily to kill. A warning. He turned back to her, anger suddenly forced into the same room as comprehension. Who? He demanded. She pressed her cheek to Nerio's hair and said the one name that tasted like poison in his mouth. Dorian. Then she started to cry with the exhausted, furious dignity of a woman who had not allowed herself tears in front of anyone for too long. He took them back to the city that night. Aurelia resisted until she realized resistance would keep Nerio on an exposed coast, with armed men already sighting windows. Elias Verden arrived just before dusk and tried very politely to argue that Cassian's world had done enough damage. Cassian nearly hated him for the concern in his eyes, for the way Aurelia relaxed fractionally when the doctor spoke. Jealousy is an ugly emotion on any man, on a man who has just discovered he has a child and a history built on half-truths. It becomes almost feral. Yet Elias only packed medicines, kissed Nerio's forehead, and told Aurelia he would keep the cottage watched. When they drove south beneath a hard moon, Nerio slept against Aurelia in the back seat with the careless trust children reserve for people not yet old enough to understand fear. Cassian drove in silence, the city drawing closer like an old wound reopening. He could feel Aurelia's gaze on the side of his face every few miles and did not turn toward it. If he looked too long, rage and relief might become indistinguishable, and he did not yet know which of those would ruin them first. The next minutes unraveled in violence faster than memory likes to keep. Dorian moved first, not toward Aurelia, but toward the side exit where two of his men were already appearing. Cassian saw the shift through mirrored glass and crossed the ballroom like a strike of black lightning, overturning a table as guests screamed. Gideon Vale vanished into the panic. Octavian shouted for security. Celestine pulled 3 women to the floor behind a marble pillar with admirable calm. Dorian's men seized Aurelia before Cassian reached the lounge, one wrenching her arm behind her back, the other dragging her through the service corridor at gunpoint, while Dorian backed away with a composure that somehow made the chaos worse. "Bring the child," he snapped into a phone as he disappeared through a staff door. Cassian heard that one sentence, and everything human in him went white-hot. Nerio had been upstairs with Sabina in a secured suite. Somewhere between the gala floor and the alarms, Dorian had set another hand in motion. Cassian tore through the service corridor with Renzo at his shoulder, and murder riding so close under his skin it felt like a second pulse. Behind him, the gala had dissolved into broken glass, shrieking strings, and the stampede panic of the powerful, realizing wealth could not stop bullets. Aurelia had twisted free from one of Dorian's men when the crowd surged. Talia had gotten to her. For one blinding second, that knowledge was the only reason Cassian did not stop to kill everyone in the hallway. Nerio, Sabina. The phone call Dorian had barked into the chaos kept repeating in his skull with the rhythm of a death sentence. They reached the private suite on the mezzanine level in time to find the door splintered inward and one of Cassian's guards sprawled unconscious against the wall with blood drying black at his temple. The second guard lay face down near the bar, breathing shallowly, fingers still curled around a gun he had not gotten to fire. The room smelled of cordite, perfume, and the hot metallic bite of violence. A half-finished teacup rested on the low table beside Sabina's shawl, as if the evening had split in two mid-breath. On the carpet near the balcony door was Nerio's wooden Mayan. Cassian stopped dead. There are objects that cease being objects the moment fear touches them. The toy lion, carved by Sabina's own brother decades earlier and sanded smooth by Nerio's small hands over the past week, looked impossibly innocent where it lay on its side in the pale wash of chandelier light. Cassian crouched and picked it up with fingers that had never trembled in a firefight and were trembling now. One of the lion's wooden paws had been snapped off, not by accident. On the underside, tucked into the fracture, was something small and dark, a rosary bead. Sabina's. Not panic, not surrender, a message. Cassian looked up so sharply, Renzo took a step back. She left a trail, Renzo said. No, Cassian said, already moving. She left me a destination. Because Sabina never wore her old black rosaries to formal events. Only one of them traveled with her always, the one with dark volcanic beads and a tiny silver saint medallion bought in the harbor district 50 years ago, the year the Veraces still used the abandoned St. Dismas foundry as a safe house when wars made the city streets too visible. The old foundry sat near the docks, among dead cranes and rusted rails, its chapel alcove preserved by Sabina's stubborn sentiment long after the rest of the building had been left to salt and rats. As a child, Cassian had hidden there during storms. As a man, he had sealed it and forgotten it existed. Sabina had not forgotten. Sabina never forgot anything that once mattered. Aurelia met him in the hallway just beyond the service doors. Her hair was half fallen from its pins, one earring gone, the garnet silk at her shoulder torn where someone had grabbed her too hard. There was blood on her wrist that was not hers. Talia stood beside her, speaking into comms line, face white with fury. For one splintered instant, Cassian saw only Aurelia alive and almost pulled her into him. Then her eyes dropped to the lion in his hand, and she went still in the way people do when terror becomes too large to spend all at once. They took him, she whispered. Cassian nodded once. Aurelia made a sound he would hear for the rest of his life. It was not a scream. It was what a scream becomes when it has to pass through a mother's body without shattering the child she is trying to save. He caught her by the shoulders before she could stagger. Listen to me. His voice was iron forced through fire. Our son, he said, and the words cut straight through all the old wreckage between them. Yes, which is why you are going to breathe, Aurelia, and let me get him back. Her face changed then, not into calm exactly, but into the kind of terrible composure that only appears when love has no room left for denial. I'm coming. No. She laughed once, sharp and joyless. Don't be stupid enough to think you can stop me. Under other circumstances, he might have argued longer. He might have tried to lock her in the armored car and let her hate him later. But Dorian was not only using their son, he was using history, fear, the same machinery that had once kept Aurelia silent. And Cassian had spent 3 years learning what happened when one person tried to carry terror alone. He would not repeat that mistake for either of them. So he leaned close, forehead nearly touching hers amid the chaos of rushing staff and distant sirens, and said the only thing that mattered. Then you stay beside me, not behind me, beside me, and if I tell you to run with Nerio, you do it. Aurelia's jaw tightened. Only if you tell me the same. It should have been impossible to love someone more in a hallway full of blood and broken crystal. He did anyway. The drive to the harbor split the city into wet ribbons of reflected light. Rain hammered the windshield so hard the wipers could barely keep up. Renzo drove. Talia stayed behind to lock down the gala, seize the lounge recording before Dorian's men could erase it, and make sure Gideon Vale did not leave the building under cover of public chaos. Myrick worked from a second car with 3 laptops open and a police scanner hissing across the seats. Aurelia sat in back beside Cassian, clutching the wooden lion so tightly the broken edge pressed a white line into her palm. She had stopped crying. That frightened him more than tears. She won't let him be afraid, Cassian said after several miles of silence. Aurelia turned to him. Sabina, he said, she won't let Nerio feel what's happening if she can help it. She'll make it a game, a story. She always did that. Aurelia shut her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, there was gratitude in them so raw it almost undid him. He liked stories about kings and lions. Cassian looked at the toy lion in her hand. Then he'll think he's with one. At the foundry, the sea wind came off the black water like a warning. St. Dismas stood at the end of a row of dead warehouses, all iron skeleton and crumbling brick, its broken windows glimmering with dockside sodium light. Rust climbed the loading cranes like old blood. Long ago, the place had processed gilded church fittings and brasswork for wealthy parishes. Later, it had sheltered guns, bodies, and secrets. Tonight, it waited with every mouth of shadow open. Mirek's voice crackled through Cassian's earpiece. Thermals show 6 heat signatures inside the main hall, 2 in the east office, and 1 moving near the old furnace room. Could be more underground. Cameras are new. Dorian renoted enough to be annoying. Any sign of Sabina and the boy? A beat. Then Mirek said quieter. 2 smaller signatures in the chapel alcove, close together, 1 pacing nearby. Cassian felt the world narrow to a point. Renzo parked behind a collapsed loading platform. Weapons were checked, routes marked. The old plan dissolved under the weight of what mattered now. Talia called in from the gala. Gideon had fled through the service garage, but one of her contacts was on him. Octavian had vanished before private security could lock the exits. The lounge recording had uploaded before Dorian ripped the transmitter loose. Not enough for final justice. Enough to start a fire. "Get the rest," she told Cassian, "and don't die before I get to enjoy Vale's face." They entered through a side access tunnel that still smelled faintly of oil and cold stone. The deeper they moved, the more the foundry seemed to remember its old life. Iron tracks, hook chains, patches of gilt dust embedded in cracked concrete where molten metal had once poured. Aurelia followed in silence, one hand on the wall when the darkness thickened, the other wrapped around the toy lion tucked into her coat. Cassian had never seen courage look more breakable or more unstoppable. Voices carried from ahead. Dorian was not shouting. That was what made him monstrous. Men like him did not need volume. They used calm the way other people used weapons. "You should have kept him upstairs," he was saying. "Children never improve in negotiation." Sabina answered in a voice old enough to carry contempt like scripture. "And yet here you are, relying on one." Cassian edged to the lip of the corridor and looked in. The main hall opened beneath a lattice of steel beams and broken skylights. Rain leaked through in silver threads. Portable flood lamps threw harsh white islands across the floor. Near the far wall, where a small devotional alcove still held a soot-blackened saint behind cracked glass, Sabina sat in a wooden chair with her wrists tied to its arms. Her silver hair had come loose. There was blood at one temple. Nerio sat on the floor beside her, not bound, wrapped in Sabina's dark shawl and clutching her knee with one hand. His little face was pinched pale with confusion, but he was not crying. Sabina had done exactly what Cassian said she would. She had turned terror into endurance. A guard paced nearby with a pistol at his side. Dorian stood in the center of the hall as if hosting a private recital. His jacket was off, his tie loosened. He looked almost relaxed. Beside him, to Cassian's cold disbelief and then immediate clarity, stood Octavian. Of course. Family rarely betrays with original imagination. It uses old resentments and polished self-pity. Octavian's expression was not triumphant. It was brittle, damp at the hairline, the face of a man who had wanted profit without consequence and finally discovered consequence had his name memorized. Dorian checked his watch. "He'll come," he said. "He always comes for family," Sabina replied. Octavian flinched at the word family as though it were a slap. Cassian's fury sharpened into something nearly clean. He gestured silently to Renzo. 2 guards left, 1 right, Dorian, mine. Then Nerio moved. It was the smallest motion, a tired child turning his head toward a sound only he had caught. But Cassian saw his son glance toward the corridor where they hid, and in that instant he understood with a force almost painful that the boy knew. Not details, not names, but knew his father was near, in the old primal way children sense rescue before it arrives. Nerio's eyes found the darkness. Then, impossibly, he did not speak. He only pressed closer to Sabina and held still. Cassian would remember that act of trust more vividly than any oath another man had ever sworn him. Dorian followed the child's gaze. Enough, Cassian said, stepping into the light. The room changed. Sabina's shoulders dropped half an inch. Nerio made a breathless sound. Papa, so small it might have been imagined if Cassian had not felt it hit him like a blade wrapped in velvet. Aurelia came out behind him, despite every survival instinct telling her to stay hidden, and when Nerio saw her, the restraint Sabina had built in him cracked. Mama! The guard near them grabbed the child by the arm and hauled him up. Everything in Cassian's body tried to lunge. He stopped it with brute force. Dorian smiled. There he is. Let them go, Cassian said. Eventually. Octavian found the courage to speak because Dorian was beside him. You could have made this simple, signed what needed signing, let the business evolve. Cassian did not even look at him. When this is over, I'll decide whether you die in prison or in the family crypt. Octavian went gray. Dorian, however, seemed almost invigorated. Still dramatic. Prison did so little for your humility. His gaze slid to Aurelia. And you, I underestimated your appetite for repetition. Back in another room, watching another man's life hang on your silence. Aurelia stepped forward before Cassian could stop her. Rainwater dripped through the broken roof into the gold dust at her feet, darkening it to mud. She looked not frightened now, but incandescent with the exhaustion of someone who had lived too long under a hand at her throat. No, she said, not silence, not this time. Dorian's smile thinned. You think because he knows the story you've become brave? No, you've become inconvenient. He nodded toward the pacing guard. The guard yanked Nerio closer and pressed the muzzle of his gun to the child's small shoulder. Sabina moved faster than anyone her age should have. She drove both bound wrists and the chair sideways into the man's knees with such force he lost balance. The shot fired wild into the stone ceiling. Nerio screamed. Renzo took the guard through the throat from the shadows a fraction of a second later. The hall exploded. Gunfire cracked from the catwalk. Octavian ducked and ran for cover because cowardice is often the purest instinct. Aurelia dropped to her knees and crawled toward Nerio as glass shattered overhead. Cassian shot one man, then another, then was on Dorian through the smoke and echo, the two of them slamming into a metal work table hard enough to buckle its legs. Dorian fought like a man who had spent years letting others do violence for him, but had never entirely lost the taste. He drove a blade across Cassian's ribs. Cassian felt heat, then wet. He answered with his elbow to Dorian's jaw, heard teeth crack, and kept going. They crashed through old tools and rusted chains. Dorian laughed blood into Cassian's face. She still chose it. 3 years and she still chose your cage. Cassian hit him hard enough to split skin over bone. She chose to keep me alive. Behind them, Aurelia reached Nerio just as a second guard seized her by the hair. Sabina, still tangled in the fallen chair, grabbed the dead guard's dropped weapon and shot from the floor with both tied hands. The bullet took the man in the calf. He howled, lost his grip, and Aurelia tore free, dragging Nerio behind an iron pillar as Renzo cleared the catwalk with methodical brutality. Octavian tried to flee through the east office. He got 3 steps before Talia shot out the doorframe beside his head and walked in from the loading entrance with federal lights flashing blue behind her through the broken windows. She had arrived with 2 agents too angry at Gideon Vale's years of corruption to wait for formal warrants. "End of the line, gentlemen," she called. Dorian heard the sirens, the boots, the way the building's exits were filling, and finally lost his smug patience that had made him seem invulnerable. He drove a hidden blade into Cassian's side and twisted. Pain went white. Cassian staggered. Dorian broke free and sprinted not for the door, but for the chapel alcove where Aurelia crouched behind the pillar with Nerio. Of course, predators flee toward leverage. He caught Aurelia by the throat before Cassian could close the distance and wrenched her backwards against him, gun appearing in his free hand as if it had always belonged there. Nerio cried out and clung to Sabina, who had finally managed to tear the rope from one wrist against the broken chair metal. The whole room froze around the sight of a barrel pressed under Aurelia's jaw. "Drop them," Dorian said. No one moved. Rain tapped through the ceiling. Sirens approached. The saint in the cracked alcove looked down through soot as though it had seen too much human stupidity to be surprised anymore. Cassian straightened slowly despite the blood soaking his shirt. "You're finished." Dorian's breathing had changed. Beneath the composure was the first note of true disorder. "No," he said, "not if the story ends right. You know stories, Cassian. Noble wife, damaged Don, child as witness. Tragic." He pressed the gun harder against Aurelia's skin. "Drop the weapon." Cassian did not. Instead, Aurelia did something so small and so impossibly brave that for the rest of his life he would replay it whenever anyone asked him what courage looked like. She stopped struggling, not because she surrendered, but because she went still. 3 years earlier, in a courtroom, fear had stolen language from her. Tonight she took stillness back and made it hers. Dorian mistook the change to collapse. His grip shifted by half an inch. Enough. Aurelia spoke, voice raw and carrying through the whole